Today, we as citizens must face the fact that we live in a violent society. Every day, it seems, an innocent person becomes the victim of another ruthless murder. But even more alarming is the growing number of mass murders. Those crimes where one homicidal maniac brutally kills several innocent people with no apparent motive. This type of heinous crime has never been more prevalent than during this century. And that is why we bring you
I think it's difficult to understand. I think that the idea we all have some elements of hostility in ourselves, some potential violence within all of us, that under some conditions we could kill. It's difficult to think that we would find it pleasurable, erotic, enjoyable to quietly strangle one person if they're not. I don't think that's part of the normal human who has been socialized within a particular culture. That's a peculiar thing. I think it is a very unusual, psychiatrically disturbed type of pleasure.
In 1962, the city of Boston fell into the grip of a psychopathic killer who raped and strangled 13 women. For 2 years, the city was paralyzed by this madman who became known as the Boston Strangler. His victims ranged in age from 19 to 85 years old. What made their deaths even more horrifying was that in each case, the victims were discovered lying in gruesome positions with their legs spread wide and the murder weapon twisted tightly around their necks and tied into a neat bow. On November 5th, 1964, a man named Albert DeSalvo was arrested for rape in an unrelated case. After further investigation, it was eventually learned that this unassuming plumber was indeed the demented strangler of those 13 women. Apparently, DeSalvo had used his handyman trade as a way of entering the apartments of these unsuspecting women.
The man showed a detailed knowledge of superintendents of apartment buildings in hundreds of apartments in the greater Boston area. He could call them by name, and he would refer to the first and last name of the superintendent and say, he sent me to do some specific repair work. He would also use the name, both first and last name, of the resident of the apartment. Mary, the superintendent Harry Jones sent me. Mrs. Smith, the superintendent Fred Brown sent me. This was his standard method of gaining entry and to get potential victims to relax to let him get into the apartment.
The extent of DeSalvo's lust for rape led him to commit these brutal crimes. But what made these murders especially notable was his trademark of tying a bow around each of his victims' necks. He wanted his handiwork to be recognized.
It's not an uncommon thing with people who engage in serial murders. They leave some sort of clues because now they have acquired another little small joy in their life. Beating or putting off or feeling superior to a huge enterprise called the criminal justice system, that they are able not simply to kill and get away with it, but leave little telltale elements behind to provoke and make those police and detectives feel unhappy. You found that, I suppose, most classically with Jack the Ripper, who sent postcards and letters to newspapers and the police indicating, giving himself the name, Jack the Ripper. Try to catch me. In effect, they try to do that. Now, it could be to tease them, or it can be, as some people have suggested, sort of leaving clues so that they're being caught, annihilated, can be sped up. William Hirons, who killed some people, wrote the famous phrase on a mirror, "Catch me before I kill more." That may be that element too. So it's complicated, but I suspect it's like, I'm still smarter than the police, as uneducated as I am. I leave them little notes to make them feel provoked and unhappy. Here I am killing and you can't do anything about it.
By the time it became evident that DeSalvo was indeed the Boston Strangler, the court proceedings had become mired in a web of confusion. While DeSalvo had freely admitted in prison that he was the Strangler, the doctors had declared that he was mentally incompetent to testify in court. As a result, the courts were unable to charge DeSalvo with the murders, and instead, they could only convict him of the rape charges for which he was originally arrested. While DeSalvo awaited his prison sentence, he was temporarily placed in a mental hospital. Then one morning, A guard looked into his room and discovered that the Boston Strangler had escaped. Apparently, DeSalvo had gained access to a key and was able to open his own door. Fortunately for the police, DeSalvo gave himself up the very next day. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment. When DeSalvo was finally sent to jail, his lawyer, the well-respected F. Lee Bailey, tried to have DeSalvo placed in a mental institution. What we should do with DeSalvo, he argued, is to try to figure out what kind of man would rape and strangle to death innocent women. We should find out what exactly was his motivation for these 13 brutal slayings.
In every case, there was some considerable sexual pleasure in seizing control over a woman, frightening her, brutalizing her in some way, having sex with her, and frequently it ends here. He went on and found there was an additional pleasure, thrill, satisfaction with killing. So his package became sexual pleasure, gratification, and an equal, perhaps even greater pleasure in killing a defenseless woman.
In 1973, 6 years into his prison sentence, Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, was found stabbed to death in his cell, a befitting end to one of the cruelest murderers of the 20th century. On the morning of July 15, 1966, the city of Chicago woke up to the shocking news that 8 student nurses had been brutally murdered in their dormitory the night before. As the Chicago police carried out one corpse after another, the question in everyone's mind was, who would do such a thing? Gradually, the gruesome details of this horrifying mass murder became clear. Apparently, a man armed with a gun and knife had entered this 2-story apartment in the evening. He forcefully corralled the 6 women he saw into one of the bedrooms and tied them up. He then waited for the rest of their roommates to arrive. When 3 more nurses returned to the apartment, the intruder tied them up and put them into the same room. Inside the apartment, the blood-stained wreckage revealed the sadistic manner in which the killer then disposed of these innocent women. The killer proceeded to take each woman, one at a time, and strangle or stab her to death in one of the other rooms. Rape was apparently not his only motive, as he had sex with only one of the women. His main purpose, it seemed, was simply cold-blooded murder. However, one of the women managed to escape by hiding under a bed. Amazingly, the killer had lost count of his captives, and when he finished murdering the 8th woman, he left the building. The woman in hiding later ran to the police, and despite being in shock, was able to give them a description.
About 6 feet tall, 25 years of age, a white man with a crew cut, wearing a black or dark shirt and a light jacket, might be discovered by some citizen, and the information relating to his activities reported to us.
2 days after the brutal slayings, the police arrested a man who fit the description to a T. His name was Richard Speck, a 24-year-old former merchant marine and current drifter. When Speck's fingerprints matched those at the scene of the crime, the police knew for sure they had their man, a cold-blooded killer who, for some unknown reason, decided one night to snuff out the lives of 8 student nurses.
I find it very difficult to believe that he planned he was going to go in and rape a large number of women, let alone kill each of them one at a time. He went in with a gun and knife. He tied them up. He perhaps went in order to burglarize an empty apartment, or to break into an apartment and rob the people, or break in, rob, and rape some. But it's difficult to believe that he went in here with the idea prefixed in his mind that he was going to kill these people one at a time. A most peculiar and unusual way of doing these type of things. Killing sometimes is as big a charge. I think in his particular case, it became a bigger charge in the actual sexual acts themselves. He only does it once, and my feeling would be with the first girl. Thereafter, he found simply strangling them or stabbing them to death gave him a greater pleasure than having any type of sexual behavior with him. So therefore, one act of rape and 8 acts of killing. It was something he enjoyed. He continued to do it. He spent an entire evening doing it.
The victims of Richard Speck were all young nurses who were being trained to help save lives. Some were from Chicago, some were from abroad, some were engaged, but each of them had high hopes for a long and fruitful life. Then on the night of July 14th, 1966, those hopes came to an end when a stranger showed up at their home and savagely murdered each one of them for the sake of some demented personal pleasure. A parent of one of the victims could hardly fathom the cruelty that took place. For all the relatives, this would be a tragedy that would never go away. As Speck appeared in court, one couldn't help but wonder how this helpless-looking man could have massacred 8 women. Yet there had been signs of violence in his past. Just 1 year earlier, Speck had been arrested for threatening a woman with a knife. After serving a brief sentence, he now was facing the ultimate penalty. For his senseless slaughter, the jury sentenced Speck to die by the electric chair. As Speck awaited his fate, the Supreme Court ruled against the death penalty. The courts then changed Speck's sentence from death to 8 consecutive terms of life imprisonment.
The vast bulk of all people who are imprisoned for the crime of murder and given a life sentence or a large number of years tend to be released. Well, in the over 95% of all people. Even if you get several hundred years, as he has, and one day or another, there will be a commutation of sentence. He will be eligible for parole. After turning him down 1 year after another, in time, he will be released. He will go free one day, be hoping that he has paid the price, that the number of years compensates for the crime. His case, 8 women versus so many years in prison. The chances are now, if I were to bet, I would bet that Speck will one day be released from prison after having served 15, 20, 30 years and go into normal life, whatever normal life is for him. Will he repeat the event? A question you've asked. I don't know, nor does anybody else. People think that they can tell you one way or another. They're lying to you or to themselves.
Would Richard Speck ever repeat the ruthless crime that took the lives of 8 women? One can only hope that we never give him that opportunity. In 1966, less than a month after the brutal slaying of 8 student nurses in Chicago, another mass murder took place on the serene campus of the University of Texas. The mad killer in this case was a man named Charles J. Whitman, who on the outside seemed like your all-American male. However, inside Whitman, there burned an angry rage, a rage that would one day send him on a killing spree that would stun the world. As a young boy growing up in Florida, it seemed like Whitman was always around guns. As a hobby, he liked to shoot target practice and go hunting. His father, Charles A. Whitman, was a successful plumbing contractor who emphasized strict discipline in his household. One person he didn't have to worry about was Charles, who was described by some as a perfectionist. By the age of 12, he had become an Eagle Scout, quite an achievement at such a young age. After graduating from high school, Charles joined the Marines in 1959, where he developed into a superb marksman with a rifle. During his military service, he attended the University of Texas on an ROTC scholarship. There he met Kathleen Leisner, a student who was studying to become a teacher. In 1962, Charles and Kathy were married. For Charles Whitman, who was an honest student in engineering, everything seemed to be falling into place. Unknown to most people, however, Charles would, at times, become extremely hostile, even beating his wife for no apparent reason. He often expressed resentment of his father for being such a domineering parent. His father, he claimed, had beaten his mother several times, and Charles was afraid he was becoming the same way. In 1966, Whitman received a phone call from his mother in Florida telling him that they had just become separated. At her request, Charles went down to Florida, picked her up, and drove her back to Austin, Texas, so she would be near her son. The separation of his parents upset Charles greatly, and his resentment of his father increased. A month later, at the urging of his wife, Charles saw a psychiatrist. There, Whitman explained how he was suffering from sudden bursts of hostility for no real reason. The doctor made another appointment for Charles, but he would never return. On the night of July 31st, 1966, Whitman went into an unexplainable rage. First, he went to his mother's house and stabbed her to death. Then he went home and waited for his wife. When Kathy showed up, he murdered her in the same brutal way. The next morning, Whitman headed out to the school's administration building, armed with an assortment of guns and ammunition. As he ascended the 30-story building, he clubbed and shot to death 3 people who were in his path. When he reached the top, he prepared to launch an attack on the unsuspecting public below. Whitman's strategic positioning not only gave him complete access to the surrounding area, but it also provided him protection from any gunfire below. The sharpshooting ex-Marine freely fired away with his high-powered rifle. In just 10 minutes, he managed to kill 10 people and wound 31. Once the police became aware, they fired back, pinning Whitman down behind one of the walls. The gun battle lasted for nearly 90 minutes before the police stormed the tower and killed the mad gunman named Charles J. Whitman. Now the big puzzle remained. Why did he do it? What caused this man to turn his inner rage into a mass execution of innocent people? After killing his mother and wife, he then turned his hostility toward society itself. The 10 who died were unsuspecting citizens, unaware that a killer with a long-range rifle had targeted them for death. It was one of the worst mass murders of the century.
Whitman was the one close example, particularly the last part of his killings, to a mass murderer. In a short period of time, he begins to kill people for apparently no reason at all. It is similar to other mass murders that have taken place. The first or second killing seems to be somewhat understood. We can vaguely empathize with those. But after the second or the third, the killings seem to have no purpose at all. He's into a world of killing simply for the sake of killing. No erotic pleasure that I can see, no other type of pleasures that would motivate us. But it is killing until he is finally caught by the police, killed by the police, and then you throw up your hand and say, why in the world did he do that? And the answer is, nobody knows why he did that.
The once serene campus of the University of Texas had now been turned into chaos. Even the majestic clock tower, once the symbol of this school's proud heritage, had been transformed into a monument of death. Whitman's body was taken for examination to see if perhaps there was some biological reason for his behavior. As it turned out, the doctors discovered a tumor in his brain that could have been putting pressure on his aggressive nerve center. Some people used this discovery as the explanation for Whitman's insane behavior.
Why people like the idea of a brain tumor is because it's a simple, commonsensical, easily observable reason for behavior. I look, I see a tumor, and that causes behavior. I look at speck in some way and see an XYY chromosome. But how do you see jealousy, unhappiness, being defeated by life, sexual lust, and so forth? These things are not easily observed or understood. But something like a tumor makes sense. Something like a peculiar chromosome makes sense. I don't think they account for much in these cases. But people want simple answers because these are simple people. They're, after all, only murderers. And murderers are simple to understand. Of course they're not. But we want such a simple thing to explain his. Did the tumor explain both the killing of the mother and his wife? We roughly understand that. And the killing of total strangers the next day. What a remarkable tumor that must be to have driven him to such peculiar behavior.
Perhaps the most bizarre crime of the 20th century involved the case of Charles Manson, a self-proclaimed savior. Manson had attracted a family of fanatical followers, a group of runaways and misfits who obeyed his every command. and led them to commit the most publicized and barbaric murders of our time. On the night of August 8th, 1969, actress Sharon Tate, along with 4 others, was savagely murdered in her home in Beverly Hills. The 25-year-old actress was 8 months pregnant when she was discovered the next day lying in a pool of blood. She had been stabbed 16 times. Her husband, film director Roman Polanski, was in Europe at the time. Found next to Tate on the living room floor was the body of Jay Sebring, an internationally known hairstylist. He had been shot once and stabbed 7 times. Out on the lawn, 2 more bodies were found, Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski. Folger was stabbed 28 times. Frykowski, who showed signs of putting up a fight, had been shot twice and stabbed an incredible 51 times. When the police arrived the next day, they were stunned by the brutality of the killings. No one could believe that such a crime could have been committed in one of the wealthiest sections of America. After sorting through the crime scene, it became obvious that there was no motive other than murder. Nothing had been stolen. Then 2 days later, another brutal slaying occurred. Lino LaBianco and his wife, Rosemary, were found stabbed to death in their home in Los Feliz. Rosemary was stabbed with a knife 41 times. Lino was stabbed 12 times with a knife and 14 times with a kitchen fork. On a wall, the murderers used the victim's blood to write, "Death to pigs." At the time, the police made no connection between this crime and the Tate murders. Meanwhile, out in Death Valley, there existed a small commune made up of runaways, drifters, and outcasts. Their leader, Charles Manson, was a troublemaker who had spent half his life in prison for crimes ranging from auto theft to running a ring of prostitution. On October 10th, 2 months after the Tate murders, Manson and his followers were arrested and charged for auto theft. While in jail, one of Manson's girls bragged to a fellow inmate about the Tate murders they had committed. Soon after, word got around, and eventually detectives pieced the puzzle together. Evidently, Manson had instructed 3 of his girls to go to Tate's house and kill everyone in sight. The girls who were put on trial for the brutal stabbings were Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. As the court case proceeded, a key witness emerged. One of Manson's followers, Linda Kasabian, had been assigned as the lookout for both the Tate and LaBianca murders. Kasabian testified that Manson had ordered both murders and that the participants were the 3 girls mentioned, as well as Charles Tex Watson, who was used as the gunman. As the story unfolded, the public became appalled and yet fascinated with Charles Manson, an unimpressive-looking man who was somehow able to attract a fanatical following and lead them to barbaric destruction. Manson apparently had the personality and the charisma to gain such obedience.
It's difficult to say what makes up a charismatic leader. Adolf Hitler wasn't the beauty of our time, yet nevertheless he was almost a classic example of somebody who inflamed the population to follow him through disastrous types of events. Or Winston Churchill was not, except for his beautiful ability to articulate. Manson had a series of talents which did penetrate these people. He did convince them in some ways. And he was quasi-religious in many different ways, particularly parts of the Bible that he interpreted in a rather peculiar manner.
Just as intriguing was Manson's master plan to take over the world. He called his mission Helter Skelter, a name taken from a Beatles song. His strategy was to ignite a black uprising against the whites. Once the blacks gained control, Manson and his followers would then come out of hiding and assume leadership for the blacks, whom Manson felt lacked the experience to lead themselves. But what about the brutal murders? Was that part of the master plan? Did his followers really believe that killing Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas was the right step towards gaining control of the world? Whether they actually believed it or not, they did believe in following the orders of Charles Manson. When Manson appeared in court, reporters tried to understand this fanatical leader.
I don't accept the whole situation. You know, like I was in the desert minding my business. This confusion belongs to you. It's your confusion. I don't have any confusion. I don't have any guilt. I know what I've done, and no man can judge me. I judge me.
What have you done, Charlie?
I've stayed in the desert and run with the coyotes and ate off the plants and found out you could live out there without this society. And that's where I'd like to go live, you know. But you won't let me go, will you?
You don't owe anything to society?
Pardon?
You don't owe anything to society now?
Owe him anything? I've paid him 22 years of my life. You know, I'm the other end of your society. You know, so you can ride your bicycles and do your thing. I live in your reform schools and your orphanages. I'm not against you. I'm not against you. Huh?
Are you bitter?
Bitter? No.
But
No.
you feel you've paid some price so far in your life.
Price?
To society, you said it.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make you bitter?
I don't know what that means.
How do you feel right now? Do you feel good feelings towards the judge?
I
your
feel a little
potential
nervous.
jurors?
A little nervous. I feel good feelings towards everything. I feel no bad. I know no bad.
Okay, gentlemen, that's about it.
The jury found Manson and the 3 women guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder. They were all sentenced to life imprisonment. Even though Manson did not physically kill anyone, the jury felt that he had such complete control of the girls that by ordering them to kill, he was just as guilty. As in all cases that involve a mass murderer, one question always arises. Was the killer sane or insane? Was Charles Manson sane when he ordered his fanatical followers to brutally kill innocent people in an effort to rule the world?
The classic legal definition, which still persists in most jurisdictions, is right from wrong. Did they know that what they were doing was wrong? I think he was not insane. I suspect that at some level he knew he was playing a game. He was conning these people. I don't think he ever fell into that himself. If that is indeed to be established, then clearly he was sane and he's to blame. He's to assume full legal blame for what took place. Were his disciples insane? It's a difficult question. Court said no, that they were sane, and I think I would go along with that too.
When analyzing mass murderers like Charles Manson, it's always tempting to claim that they were insane. How else can we explain their demented behavior? However, in the 4 cases we have seen today, Albert DeSalvo, Richard Speck, Charles Whitman, and Charles Manson, each of these men knew full well what they were doing, knew it was wrong, and yet committed these terrible crimes anyway. As we continue to search for answers, one thing we can look at is what they all had in common. In these 4 cases, each man seemed to derive pleasure from controlling the fate of their victims in one way or another.
It is called, I think, among sociologists, power, the ability to control the actions, behavior, outcome of others, and they have it in a supreme godlike sense. So by whim alone, Whitman in the tower, aiming his gun, kills some, wounds some, because he decides to shoot at that target rather than others. Manson, I suspect, chooses a household whimsically and sends his troops out to do the killings there. Speck finds himself in a fortuitous circumstance. It could well be that part of the pleasure is I can decide whether to let them live or die, and I'm in every case going to kill them, but I still make those decisions, and it is so pleasurable. I have life and death control over total strangers, and you notice they always carry out that life and death control in these cases by killing them. And therefore, there is some additional pleasure involved. Besides controlling them, there is that additional, feeling that is accomplished by putting them out of their misery.
Today, we as citizens must face the fact that we live in a violent society. And as long as there are people who derive pleasure from inflicting pain on his fellow man, this trend will continue. This has been a presentation of The Worst Crimes of the 20th Century.